What's amazing about this exhibition is it shows that over 50 years of Monet's career, so he was working for 60 years, so this is really the majority of his career, he is repeatedly painting buildings. But what we see over that period is the evolution of his style. So we have the pictures from the 1860s, which are very representative, all the way through to the pictures of the first years of the 20th century, where the colours are brighter, the forms are dissolving, and he's really pushing into the modernism that we'll see in that century.
Well, we hope that the exhibition is new in many respects, and in doing research for the exhibition, I've tried to introduce some new elements into our understanding of Monet, and looking at architecture is a new dimension to the way we understand his work, and we've tried to explore that by showing how varied it was, that when Monet looked at architecture in his pictures, he looked at it in many different ways, and that's what we've tried to bring out.
We wanted to look at Monet's paintings of buildings because this is a really unexpected way of thinking about this artist. We always think of him as a painter of landscapes, of the coast, of the sea, and of course his later pictures of his gardens in Giverny. But by looking at his pictures of buildings, something he's doing throughout his life, we really look closely at how Monet is structuring his paintings. So the first section is called the Village and the Picturesque. So the picturesque is an aesthetic that really looks at medieval buildings, at sort of ramshackle cabins, as opposed to more classical architecture that you might expect. And this is something that's very popular during Monet's lifetime and something he's interested in. He's traveling to a lot of locations to find the picturesque, and that's what we see in these pictures. Well, if we look at these pictures that we have here, painted on the cliffs of Varengeville in 1882, we see Monet moving his easel to a variety of sites, painting the same cliff, painting the same church on the top, on the very edge, teetering on the edge of the cliff, in order to structure his composition in different ways. So we see him both painting from the top of the cliff and also going onto the beach at low tide to look up at the church. And that church, its very regimented physical structure, is giving him a real foil for nature, a real contrast to the ragged lines of the coast around it. I think the colour is something that's really brought out by this exhibition, by how he's using, for example, in a painting here, red roofs on new buildings built on the top of a cliff in contrast to the green that surrounds them. And that's something, colour is something we often think about with Monet, but I think we see it in a new way with these pictures.
In 1884, Monet travelled to paint on the Mediterranean for the first time, and he went to Bordighera, a small town just across the Italian border. And while he was there, he painted both Bordighera and just up the valley, a place called Dolce Acqua, a very beautiful medieval town on a hill surrounded by a castle. And while he was at Dolce Acqua, he painted 3 canvases in a single day, and this is one of them. And what you get in that picture is Monet responding to a motif that he said was very picturesque. That's what he used in a letter to a friend. And you can see in this painting Monet's wonderful drawing. He's got that arc of that bridge absolutely splendidly placed. And that's a great characteristic of Monet's work, the drawing. Everything sits very appropriately in space. It has a solidity and an aptness on which he played with the colour and the facture. And when he was at Bordighera by the Mediterranean Sea in 1884, he painted these wonderful views which are very atmospheric. He loved the colours and the textures of the vegetation that he found there. But again, the architecture plays a role in his pictures. If you look at this central painting, which is a view of the Città Alta, the high city of Bordighera, you can see that at the top of it is the vertical accent of the campanile. That campanile was based on Saracen foundations, which might have dated back to 800 or something like that. and the campanile for the church bells had been built on it later. So there at the top, that vertical accent is an old building. But there's another vertical accent in this picture, which is that white tower in the foreground. And that was a villa built between 1873 and 1875, so within the last decade, that had been built for a French financier and politician called Raphael Bischofsheim, and it had been designed by Charles Garnier, the architect of the Paris Opera. And so here you have the old and the modern juxtaposed, and those, both the old and the modern building, act as accents, vertical accents in Monet's composition.
Monet was a man of his times, and here as we enter the second section of the 3 chapters of the exhibition, The City and the Modern, what we are looking at is Monet confronting the modern world, the world in which he lived, the world that was changing so rapidly around him, particularly the city in which he lived most of the time as a young artist, Paris. And one of the glories of the exhibition on loan to us from the Gemeente Museum in The Hague is this view of 1867. In this late spring of 1867, Monet is given permission to paint from the colonnade of the Louvre, the east facade of the Louvre, looking out over the city. And he paints a series of works from that elevated platform, looking out, in this case, across the Pont Neuf to the dome of the Pantheon on the left bank. Absolutely at the center of the picture is the statue of Henry IV. So he is telling us, he is insisting on the Parisianness of this scene, the Frenchness of this scene of the picture. His friend Renoir was painting cityscapes very, very much at the same time, and we can imagine the two of them comparing their experiments as they went. And then what you see around the room is him addressing the modern city, including the resort of Trouville, and we have 2 remarkable pictures here of Trouville in the center of the wall. And then, of course, he comes to London in 1870-71 to escape the Franco-Prussian War, and our famous, the National Gallery's famous view of Westminster showing Parliament in the hazy distance, all over and over again attempting to address what modernity means. Then back in Paris, 1872, a room in the La Samaritaine department store, and he's able to paint a rainy day in Paris in one of the most abbreviated and subtle pictures, I think, in the exhibition.
Well, one picture that we're very happy to have in the exhibition is one lent by the Musée d'Orsay of the Rue Montorgueil in Paris during a national festival, national holiday in 1878 to celebrate the success of a big exhibition in Paris. And this shows a very narrow city street where the buildings on each side, the houses, are almost completely obscured by the French flag flying. And in the street below, there's a crowd of people. So people were enjoying themselves enormously. And Monet, as a patriotic Frenchman, was very happy to paint that. But it's a picture that's also very carefully composed by him as the artist, because on each side you get V shapes leading in, drawing the buildings in, and then at the top you get another V shape bringing in the sky, and beneath bringing in the figures on the ground. So it's a carefully composed picture, although it was painted with great spontaneity. Monet himself didn't write in his letters about architecture very much, even though in his paintings he produced pictures of paintings by rather famous architects. And amongst his friends, he didn't have architects particularly, but nevertheless buildings do feature in a very important way in his work.
The third section, Monument and the Mysterious, looks at his later paintings of the 3 great series of paintings of buildings that he makes in Rouen and London and Venice, where the buildings take on a more mysterious tone within the pictures.
Well, when Monet came to London in 1899, he had worked in London once before, in 1870 to 71, a long time before, and he'd been planning to come back to London again. But it had taken him many years to finally do it. And he painted in London over extended periods in 1899, 1900 and 1901, and finally finished and exhibited those pictures in 1904. And while he was in London, he stayed at the Savoy Hotel, and he had a room with a balcony which allowed him to look down the Thames in different directions. So in the morning, he would paint looking eastwards over Waterloo Bridge and paint the sun rising in the early morning light. In the later morning, in the early afternoon, he would paint looking southwards over Charing Cross Bridge. And in the evening, he would move from the Savoy Hotel to St Thomas's Hospital, and he would paint looking westwards over the Houses of Parliament, often with the sun setting behind it. So he gave a varied treatment to London. And what fascinated him about London were the way the buildings and the bridges were hidden by the fogs, the natural fogs, and the pollution of the city, the smoke that came from people's houses and from the factories in London. And that fog was sometimes coloured. He wrote in his letters about it being green and yellow, and that's the sort of thing that fascinated him. I think the London painting behind me of the Houses of Parliament in sunset is a fascinating picture. It shows an effect which he'd actually tried out with cliffs on the Normandy coast 20 years earlier, where the light from the sun at the end of the day is behind a strong form. It is cast forward, bounces off the water, because you can see it on the River Thames here, and then is reflected back onto the building. And that's a very subtle way of painting light, and something that Monet treated very marvellously. When Monet was in London, he certainly met British artists, some of whom he had known for a long time, like the American artists James Whistler and John Singer Sargent, who were friends of his, and he admired their work. He was rather critical of British artists, who he said painted with too much detail. He said when they paint buildings, they want to paint every brick, and that was something completely different to what Monet did. Monet probably admired Turner's work and certainly would have been able to see it, but Monet was also a very competitive artist, and by the time he was working in such a concentrated way in London around 1900, a mature artist, a man of about 60, who knew exactly what he wanted to do, so he was going to do it his way.
Well, Monet was really interested in painting light, in painting air, and so they play a similar role in that they're offering him reflections, they're offering him structure, they're offering different colours and forms for him to paint in the same way as a water lily might, but they're doing so in a different way that gives him real variety in how he's constructing the pictures.
Monet's painting changed a great deal over his long career. His career was 60 years, and in this exhibition we show a span of almost 50 years. And when one looks at the early paintings, painted, the first one in this exhibition was painted when he was 23, there's a very solid quality to the buildings. And whereas when we look at the Venice pictures, painted in 1908, when he was a man in his middle 60s, these are paintings where there's much more of a diaphanous, soft quality to them, representing great subtlety of light. But even in the first picture of 1864, when he treats the clouds, you can see his fascination with the light developing.
When Monet travelled to Venice in 1908, he produced 37 pictures in total. He thought he wasn't going to really make many pictures, but ended up painting a huge quantity. And he was doing so in series, so he had a quite strict schedule, so at different times of day he moved to different locations to paint different buildings, and that's how we have a series of pictures where we see very subtle changes of light as he painted one after another.
Well, when he was painting in Venice, he painted several groups of pictures of the same building as he had done in London a few years earlier. And in the Venice pictures, there's always water in the foreground. So the light falls on the buildings in the upper half of the picture and then on the surface of the water in the lower half of the picture. And that gives the Venice pictures a particular character. And in these paintings, you can see the very, very subtle changes of light on the same motif.